A half-frozen preacher slept in her woodshed one night. He left her the deed. The woodshed door had a leather hinge, top and bottom, and when you pulled it open it made a sound like a boot being dragged across gravel. I know because I heard it twice that night, once when I pushed in out of the cold, and once around 3 in the morning when I heard her moving around in the dark on the other side of it and realized she had a rifle leveled through a gap in the boards. I'd been on the road 11 years by then. I knew when somebody meant it and when they didn't. She meant it. I said, "I'm clergy." She said, "What kind?" I said, "Methodist if it still counts." There was a long pause and then she said, "Stay on your side of the woodpile." She didn't close the door, but she went back inside and I heard the bar drop across the main door. And I lay back down on the hay bale and pulled the horse blanket up over my coat and watched the frost on the ceiling until I fell asleep again. That was November of '82. I should back up some. I'd come down the long flats from a place called Harrow Fork, where I'd been doing a burial for a sheepman named Ord Puckett, who didn't have anybody else to see him off. Puckett had been the kind of man who got along with God just fine, but made enemies of everybody standing between him and God, and he died with no family and a legal dispute still open on his water claim. I said some words over him in a field his nearest neighbor didn't dispute. Then I rode south because I had a scheduled service in Caldwell Station in 8 days, and I figured I could make it easy if the weather held. The weather did not hold. It came in hard out of the northwest 2 days out of Harrow Fork, not a blizzard but that low sullen cold that gets inside a coat and stays there. My horse Amos was 15 years old and honest as arithmetic, and he kept walking through it. But by the second afternoon, he was blowing hard and I was walking beside him to spare the weight. We came down off a long ridge and I saw the light. Farmstead, a house, a barn, one outbuilding, the woodshed, 2 horses in a small corral. A light in the window that burned steady, meaning somebody was still up or had a good lamp with oil to spare. I walked Amos to the corral gate and called out from there, the way you do. Didn't go closer. Just stood out in the dark with the cold coming through my hat brim and waited. The window light moved, a candle being carried toward the door. She opened it without opening it all the way. Dark hair, not young but not old either, maybe 40, maybe less, hard to say in the lantern light and the cold. She held the lantern up and looked at me and at Amos and said, "What do you want?" I told her I needed shelter for the horse and a corner to sleep in. I told her I was a circuit preacher, Reverend Caleb Morse, working the territory between Harrow Fork and Caldwell Station. I told her I had money to pay for what I used, which was mostly true if you counted the $3 and change in my inside pocket. She studied me for a moment in the way a woman studies a man when she's making the same calculation she's probably had to make 100 times before, whether the thing standing at her door is safe or sorry. Then she said the woodshed was open, and not to touch the wood stacked on the north wall because she'd cut it herself, and she knew exactly how it was arranged. I said yes, ma'am, and led Amos to the barn, which she did not offer but also did not forbid, and I bedded him in the empty stall beside her 2 horses and gave him water from the trough inside and a measure of oats from my saddlebag that I'd been carrying for just this kind of night. Then I took my bedroll to the woodshed and lay down on the hay bale that was there, and that is where the story properly begins. Her name was Nora Veach. I learned that the next morning, when the cold had let up enough that I figured I'd better be on my way. I knocked at the door to settle up and she opened it and said I owed her 20 cents for the stall. I paid it. She looked at my coat, which was not in good shape by then. The left sleeve had a long split along the seam from a fall I'd taken 2 weeks prior, and without saying anything about it, she went inside and came back with a needle and heavy thread and handed them to me. I said, "I'm fine." She looked at my coat sleeve. I took the needle and thread. I sat on her porch step in the cold and tried to sew the seam back together. I am not a man who sews. She watched from the doorway for about as long as a reasonable person could stand it, and then she came out and took the coat off me and went back inside with it and closed the door. I sat on the step in my shirt in the November air and waited. After a while she came back out with the coat, and the seam was right, and the thread matched close enough, and she'd put a double line of stitching along the collar where it was starting to go. I put it on. I said, "What do I owe you?" She said, "Tell me something true before you go." That stopped me. I sat back down on the step and thought about it. She sat in the chair by the door. She'd brought it out, this ladder-back chair that was missing one of its back rungs, and she had her own coat on now and her hands folded in her lap, waiting. I said, "I buried a man last week who died without anybody who loved him. Not because he was unlovable, but because he was the kind of man who spent everything he had proving to the world that he didn't need it." I said, "I've spent 11 years on a circuit that covers about 400 miles of country, and I have said words over more graves than I have preached services, and I think sometimes that is the most honest accounting of what this territory actually is." She looked out at the flats to the east. She said, "My husband died in the spring." I said I was sorry. She said he didn't leave a will. She said it plain, not asking for sympathy, just a fact she was laying out in the cold air. Then she said, "There are men in this county who know that, and they've been coming around since summer to tell me what they think ought to happen with the property." I asked her what the property was. She said 160 acres, filed and proved. Her husband had done the proving, 5 years on it, made the improvements, had the certificate. But the certificate was in his name only, and she didn't know if that was a problem or wasn't, and the men who came around seemed to think it was. And the one lawyer in Caldwell Station had told her 2 different things on 2 different visits, and charged her for both of them. I knew some land law. Not as a trained man, I'd had no training, but I'd spent enough years watching what happened to widows and homesteaders in contested territories that I'd made it my business to understand what I could. I asked her if she had the certificate. She went in and brought it out, and I read it in the morning light. Her husband's name, the legal description of the claim, the date of patent which had been issued the prior year. I told her the patent was good. Approved claim was real property, and it passed by inheritance the same as any other real property, and if she was the only heir then it was hers. She asked how she could prove that, and I said, "Do you have a marriage record?" She went inside and came back with it. I said, "You need to file this with the county land office along with a copy of your husband's death record and a simple affidavit that you are the surviving spouse." It was not complicated. It was the kind of thing that required knowing it was possible, which was most of what stood between people and their rights. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "The land office is in Morrow. That's 40 miles. She said it without self-pity, just marking the distance and what it meant for a woman alone in November. I said, "I'm going south anyway." I wasn't going anywhere near Morrow. I was going southeast, and Morrow was nearly due south, and it would add 2 days to my ride at least. She knew that too, probably. She looked at me the way she'd looked at my coat sleeve, measuring something. I said, "I can take the documents to the land office and file them for you. I've done it before. I'll need a written authorization which I can draw up if you have paper." She went inside and came back with paper, and I wrote the authorization, and she read it slowly. She read carefully, not fast, the way a person reads when they mean to understand it, and then she signed it. She brought out coffee while I was getting Amos ready to go. She handed the cup up to me where I was still in the saddle, like she didn't want me to have to dismount again and make a thing of leaving. It was the best coffee I'd had in probably 3 weeks. I told her so. She said, "I have good beans." She said it simply, without embarrassment, as if it was one of the things she knew to be true about herself. I said I'd write to her when it was filed. She gave me the name of a neighbor 3 miles east who took mail for her. I wrote it in the small book I kept in my coat pocket. Then I rode south. It took me 4 days to reach Morrow. The weather came in again on the 2nd day, and I sheltered one night in a rancher's bunkhouse and one night in a root cellar beneath an abandoned claim shack. And Amos was tired but honest about it and kept walking. I had a lot of time to think about Nora Veach and the 160 acres, and the men she'd said were coming around. I'd met those men before in other counties, going around other widows. They were patient in the way that something waiting for you to fail is patient. The land office in Morrow was run by a man named Buell, who had been running it for 12 years, and had the look of a man who had seen exactly this situation many times and had opinions about all of them. He took the documents and read them without hurry. He asked me my relation to the deceased's estate. I said I was acting as agent of record for the surviving spouse under a written authorization, which I produced. He read that too. He looked up at me over the papers. He said, "There's already a competing claim filed on this parcel." I asked who filed it. He said the name, a man named Doyle Ferris. Filed in October, citing abandonment. The claim that the land had been left without a working resident following the death of the patent holder. I asked when it was filed. He told me. I did the arithmetic in my head. It had been filed after Nora's husband died, but before the neighbor's mail route would have brought the news to anyone in Morrow, which meant Ferris had ridden hard to get here fast, which meant he'd been watching and waiting. I told Buell that the surviving spouse had been resident on the claim continuously, that there had been no abandonment, and that I had spent a night in her woodshed not 2 weeks prior, and could speak to the fact that the property was occupied and maintained. Buell looked at me. I had on my clerical collar, which I sometimes forgot I was wearing and which sometimes mattered. He looked at it now. He said, "A reverend makes an affidavit on the resident's status. That carries weight." I said I understood that. He got out paper and wrote the affidavit form, and I read it and signed it. He filed everything together, the marriage record, the death record, the surviving spouse declaration, my affidavit, and he stamped the intake date, and he said that the competing claim would be reviewed against the documentation, and that in his experience, when a patent holder died with a surviving spouse of record in residence, the abandonment claim didn't hold. I asked him how long the review would take. He said 60 days minimum, probably 90. I said, in 90 days, a man named Doyle Ferris could make an occupied widow's life extremely difficult. He looked at me over the papers again. I said, "Is there any mechanism in this office to issue a preliminary notice to the occupant confirming the claim is under active review and protected status pending resolution?" He thought about it. He said there was no standard form for that. I said, "Is there something in the nature of a letter?" He looked at me for a long moment. Then he pulled out a sheet of the county land office's letterhead stationery and he wrote one. He wrote that the claim of Nora Veach, widow, on the described parcel was under active review, and that no action adverse to the occupant's standing could be taken pending the resolution of that review, and he signed it in his official capacity and put the office seal on it. He handed it to me across the counter. He said, "You're not a lawyer." I said, "No." He said, "You've done this before." I said, "Once or twice." He looked at me the way Nora had looked at me on the porch step, like he was deciding something. Then he said, "You want a cup of coffee while I make you a copy of everything I just filed, so you have it for your records?" I said that would be appreciated. I rode back north. I had the Caldwell Station service in my book, but it was 2 Sundays out by now, and there was no way around Nora Veach's farm being on my return route, or near enough that I could make it near enough if I aimed to. I told myself I was delivering papers, which was true. I got there in 3 days. She came out of the barn when I rode in. She'd heard Amos on the frozen ground from a distance, and she had on her work coat and her hair was back, and there was chaff on her sleeve from whatever she'd been doing inside. She stood at the corral gate and watched me dismount, and she said, "You came back." I said I had papers. She took them from me and read them there in the cold, standing at the gate, turning each page. She read the whole of the land office letter twice. Then she held the papers together, and she looked at me, and her face did something that was not quite anything I had a clean word for. It wasn't relief exactly, or gratitude exactly. It was more like a door that had been braced shut for a long time, very slowly opening. She looked at me the way a person looks at something solid when they have been standing in uncertain ground. She said, "Come inside." I went inside. The house was clean and low and warm from the stove. She had a rag rug on the floor by the door in colors that somebody had put thought into, not faded yet, so not old. And there was a shelf above the window with 3 books on it and a small tin cup with dried wildflowers in it, brown by now and brittle-stemmed. She put the papers on the table and set a heavy stone on top of them to hold them flat. Then she put the kettle on. I sat in the chair nearest the stove. She stood at the stove with her back to me and she said, "Doyle Ferris has been here twice." She said it without turning around. She said he'd come the second time with another man and they'd walked the fence line and measured things and written in a notebook. She said she'd watched from the barn door with the rifle across her arm and they hadn't done anything except what I'd just described, but she'd known what it meant. That kind of measurement is a man telling you he's already decided the land is his and he's just accounting for what he's getting. I said he'll receive notice from the land office within the week. I said that notice is not a suggestion. I said when a man files a bad competing claim and the office resolves against him, he's done in that county's land books. Buell was not the kind of man who forgot who'd filed what. She turned around. She had 2 cups in her hands. She set one in front of me. She sat down across the table. She said, "Why did you go tomorrow?" She said, "That's not south." I thought about how to answer that. I said, there are things a man can do or not do when he knows a situation needs doing. I said, I've ridden past situations before. I wasn't going to do it again. She put her hands around her cup. She looked at me steadily. She had dark eyes and they were direct, not demanding, but not going to look away either. She said, "You barely know me." I said that was true. She said, "You spent 1 night in my woodshed." I said that was also true. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said my husband was a good man. He was a hard worker. He wasn't a man who talked much about things, but he worked this claim for 5 years in the cold and the heat, and he proved it, and he built this house with his own hands, and then he got sick in April and he was dead by May. She said it plain. She said, "I have been alone here since May and there are days that..." She stopped. She started again. She said there are days that are just days. You get through them. And then somebody comes along and does a thing that costs him something and doesn't ask to be thanked for it. And you don't quite know what to do with that. I said, "You don't have to do anything with it." She said, "I know that." She looked at her cup. She said, "That's what makes it something." I stayed 4 more days. Not in the woodshed. She gave me the storeroom off the back of the house, which had a cot and a window and a nail in the wall for my coat. In the mornings I helped her with the horses, and I split a cord of wood that she'd had cut and left in rounds near the barn, and I patched a section of fence on the north side where a post had heaved out of the frozen ground. In the evenings she cooked and I ate and we talked, or we didn't, and there was nothing strained about either. She talked about the claim, about what she wanted to do with the South 40 in the spring, whether to put it in wheat or keep it in grass and run more cattle. She talked about it the way someone talks about a thing they're genuinely working through in their head. She wanted my thinking. I told her wheat if she could manage the seeding herself, grass and cattle if she couldn't, that a half-operated wheat field in a dry year was worse than no wheat field. She thought about that. She said, "I can manage the seeding." I said, "Then wheat." She laughed. The first time I'd heard her laugh. It was short and real and a little surprised, like she wasn't used to it. On the 3rd evening she said, "Where do you go when you leave here?" I said, "Caldwell Station first, then back north in the spring." I said the circuit covered about 400 miles in a loose oval. I said I was usually on the road 10 months out of 12. She said, "Do you have a home anywhere?" I said, "I have a room over a hardware store in a town called Denton that I pay rent on and sleep in about 6 weeks a year." She said, "That's not a home." I said, "No, it isn't." She was quiet. Then she said, "You could come back through here in the spring." I said I usually came back through here anyway. She said, "I mean stop. Stay a few days if you needed to." She said it carefully, not making it more than it was, but not making it less either. She was looking at the fire. Her hands were around the cup again. I said I'd like that. She looked up, she nodded once, then she looked back at the fire. On the fourth morning, I got Amos ready before breakfast, and when I came in, she had eggs on the stove and bread she'd baked the day before, and she set the plate in front of me without ceremony. I ate. She sat across from me with her own plate, and we didn't make it into a thing. When I was done, I put on my coat and took my saddlebag, and she walked out to the corral with me the way she'd done that first time, except this time she was not at the gate. She was standing beside Amos. She had her hand on his neck, just resting it there, and she was looking at me in the way she had at the table when she said what she said about her husband, directly, without the door braced shut anymore. She said, "You be careful on that road." I said I always was. She said, "You're not always." She looked at my coat, at the collar that was starting to show wear again already. She said, "You come back through in the spring, I'm going to put a proper lining in that collar." I looked at her standing there with her hand on my horse and the November sky behind her, pale and cold and wide, and I thought about what it meant that she stood there like that, not asking me to stay, not holding on to me but not pretending either, just standing there, honest. I said, "I'll bring better thread." She almost smiled. Not quite. She took her hand off Amos's neck and stepped back, and I mounted up and turned him south toward the road. I didn't look back. That was a thing I'd learned a long time ago. Some goodbyes you look back at, and they become something they weren't meant to be, something smaller than what they are, and I didn't want to do that to this one. I had 400 miles of country ahead of me, and 6 weeks of services and 2 funerals I already knew about, and one I didn't yet, and a long hard winter to ride through. And somewhere on the far side of all of it there was a farmstead on the flat land north of Morrow with a light in the window, and a woman who had told me to come back. I came back. Not in the spring, end of February, earlier than I meant to, because there was a week in January when I was down in Caldwell Station, and the cold was so complete, and the days so short, and the circuit so long, and I was so, I don't have a good word for it. Empty isn't right. Worn through, maybe. Like cloth that's been washed too many times. I sat in the room above the hardware store in Denton, and I thought about 160 acres and a woman who read documents carefully because she meant to understand them, and I decided to write ahead and ask if the spring route could go north. She wrote back in 11 days, which is fast for that country. She wrote that she'd had no further trouble from Doyle Ferris, and that the land office had sent official notification that his competing claim had been denied. She wrote that the South 40 would go in wheat, and that she had hired a man named Tolliver to help with the seeding for a percentage of the yield, which I thought was a smart arrangement. She wrote that the neighbor 3 miles east had told her the winter looked to break early. Then at the bottom, in different ink, like she'd gone back and added it after she'd set the letter down and picked it up again, she wrote, "I think about the fire in the evenings and it helps." I read that line 3 times. Then I folded the letter and put it in my inside coat pocket, not in the book with the other correspondence, and it stayed there. I came back at the end of February. The ground was still frozen, but there was less bite to the wind and the light was coming back. You could see it in the afternoons, the way it sat higher on the flats than it had in December. I came down off the ridge, and I saw the light in the window again, and something moved in my chest that I'd been telling myself wasn't there, and I stopped telling myself that. She came out of the house when she heard Amos, and she was not dressed for company. She had on her work coat and her hair was loose, and she'd been doing something in the kitchen because she had flour on her hands. And when she saw me, she stopped in the dooryard and she looked at me, and then she walked straight to me while I was still getting down from the saddle, and she put her arms around me. Not carefully, not as a greeting. She just put her arms around me and her face against my coat and stood there. And I stood still with one hand still on Amos's rein. And after a moment, I put my other arm around her. She said into my coat, "I'm glad you're back." I said, "I am too." She stayed like that a moment longer, and then she stepped back and she looked up at me and her eyes were very direct and a little bright, and she said, "Well, come inside." I tied Amos to the gate and I went inside. She'd been making bread. There was dough on the board. She went back to it and I sat at the table and we talked the way we'd talked before, easy, the way two people talk when they've been thinking about talking to each other for a long time. She asked about the circuit. I told her. She told me about Tolliver and about the fence she'd extended on the east side and about a letter she'd gotten from her sister in Missouri who was thinking of coming west. She talked about the sister with something that was not quite worry and not quite hope, some mix of the two. I listened. The bread was good. The fire was good. When it got late, she said I should take the storeroom again, and I said that was fine. At the door of the storeroom, she stopped and turned, and she was close, closer than she'd meant to be, or maybe exactly as close as she'd meant to be. I couldn't say, and she said, "I've been thinking about this." I said, "I've been thinking about it too." She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "I'm not a woman who does things without thinking them through." I said, "I know." She said, "I've thought it through." I said, "So have I." She put her hand on my chest, flat, not reaching, just resting it there the way she'd rested it on Amos's neck. She said, "You're still a man on a circuit." I said, "Circuits can change." She looked at me. She said, "I'm not asking you to change anything." I said, "I know that. That's not why I do it." She looked at me for a long time with her hand flat on my chest and the lamplight low behind her, and I could feel the weight of her hand through my coat and through my shirt, and it was the steadiest I'd felt in a long time. She said, "Spring." I said, "Spring." She nodded. She took her hand back. She went to her room and I went to the storeroom, and I lay in the dark on the cot and listened to the house settle in the cold and felt the weight of her hand still, like it had left a mark there, and I was not empty or worn through. I was the opposite of that. I didn't have a word for it except full. I stayed a week. I helped her with the horses every morning. I repaired the north barn wall where a board had split in the cold. I read to her in the evenings from the 3 books on the shelf. She picked which one, always the same one, a history of the Oregon country that was dry as chalk, but she liked the maps in the front of it, liked putting her finger on a place and asking me if I'd been there. Some I had. She'd lean over my shoulder to look at where I pointed, and I could smell her hair, which was something I didn't think about while it was happening and thought about constantly the rest of the day. On the last morning, she stood in the dooryard again, and this time I did look back when I rode out. She was standing with her arms at her sides, and the pale early light was on her face, and she was watching me go without making it smaller than it was. I looked at her for as long as a man can look at something, and then I turned back to the road. I did 400 miles. I was back in May. By then the wheat was in and coming up, and Tolliver had proved reliable, and the Ferris situation was fully settled, the county record amended, the land Noravich's by every legal measure and several practical ones. I had put some thought into the circuit. I had a conversation with the district elder in Denton that I had been putting off for 2 years about whether the northern leg of the circuit could be reassigned to a younger man, and whether I might operate out of a fixed location and ride a smaller radius. The elder was a practical man, and there was a church in Morrow that had been without a permanent minister for 3 years, and he thought it could work. I told Nora that in May, sitting at the same table with the door open for the first time and the spring air coming in off the flats. She listened to all of it. She asked the right questions. What did fixed location mean for the circuit? What did it mean for the church in Morrow? What did it mean for the Winters? I told her what I knew and what I didn't. She sat with it. Then she said, "A man can do worse than Morrow." I said I knew that. She said, "It's 40 miles from here." I said, "A day and a half." She looked out the open door at the wheat coming up on the South 40, green and fine in the May light. She said, "My sister is coming in July. From Missouri." She said, "I was thinking she might like it here." She said it carefully, the way she said careful things, just putting it out there, not making it into something unless I wanted to make it into something. I understood what she was saying. If her sister came and the farm had 2 women on it, certain arrangements became possible that weren't possible with one. I said, "What does she know how to do?" Nora said, "Everything I know. They grew up the same." I said, "July is good." Nora looked at me. Her eyes were direct and bright, and the door was open behind her, and the spring light was all through the room. She said, "Caleb." She didn't say it like a question. She said it like she was testing the weight of it. I said, "Nora." She almost smiled. Then she did smile. It was the same laugh as before, short and real and a little surprised, except it was a smile this time and it stayed longer. She said, "I'll put better beans on." I said that would be appreciated. She got up to start the coffee, and I sat at that table in the spring light with the wheat coming up outside, and the door open to the flat country, and I thought about the night in the woodshed, about the leather hinges and the frost on the ceiling, and the sound of her moving around in the dark on the other side of those boards with a rifle she meant, about the porch step and the needle and thread, about her hand flat on my chest in the lamplight. There are things a man holds onto. Not because he needs to prove them to anybody, not because they make him into a story worth telling. He holds onto them because they are the true accounting of what his life was, the real register, the one that counts. I had spent 11 years on a road that was long and cold and mostly empty of the kind of thing I'm talking about, and I had done my work and I had been faithful to it. And then a woodshed door made a sound like a boot dragged across gravel, and a woman with flour on her hands and a rifle she knew how to use decided I was worth the risk of letting in. That is what I hold on to. She came back to the table with 2 cups and she set one in front of me and she sat down, and she looked at me across the table in the morning light, and I looked back at her, and there was nothing between us that needed to be explained. The coffee was good. The wheat was coming up. Outside, the country went on for a long way in every direction, flat and wide and lit up by the May sun, and it was ours to be in together, and that was enough. That was more than enough.